Writing section. Now listen to part of a lecture on the topic you just read about.
Okay, so in history, sometimes people like to look for the simplest and clearest explanations. While that may be a good rule of thumb for answering some questions, it is not always the case when seeking to understand and explain historical processes. Take the Industrial Revolution, for example. Now, you may have read about how it started in Britain in the 18th century, and that the massive social transformations were, to a large extent, driven by technological change and population growth. These were certainly two factors, but when seeking to explain the causes of such a vast process, there is often a tendency to elevate a few factors to be the most important explanatory causes, when in fact those factors are themselves tied to other factors, and so on, and it becomes less clear which is more important than the other. Now, the technological changes mentioned in your books didn't just come about out of thin air, or because a few brilliant inventors were working around the clock. In fact, the creation of new inventions required an enormous amount of financial and political support, both of which were present in Britain from around the end of the 17th century. This small island was expanding trade to its colonies during that time, and bringing in large amounts of capital. Trade and extensive geographic exploration also created a more liberalized environment in which the government at that time was willing to encourage independently financed research and development. And as goods were produced, Britain could sell them in their colonies as captive markets. For example, cotton came from India. But as a British colony, the law required that all cotton go to Britain to be made into cloth, and that was the only cloth that could be sold in India, a captive market. So you see, there was international trade, a liberalized domestic environment, and captive markets. Without them, you could have natural resources and innovation with nowhere to go. This brings us to a second point. The institutional and legal landscape in Britain had several important changes that facilitated what your text calls population growth. It is true that the population had grown sizable by the later 18th century, and that increased food supplies allowed that to happen. However, the idea that cities grew because technology drove the agricultural revolution is a gross simplification and rather inaccurate. In fact, during the 2 centuries preceding the Industrial Revolution, a series of laws were passed that forced a large percentage of the rural population off the land and into cities. And remember that up to this time, over 3/4 of all people lived in the rural land off agriculture. For example, take the enclosure movement. Traditionally, agricultural land was divided into small parcels with shared sections called commons. Among those laws I just mentioned, well, some broke up the commons and small parcels to make them available for sale to merchants who were emerging as wealthy and powerful players in colonial Britain. Technology was a part of efficiently utilizing the land that had been taken for investment, but that came later, and by that point, much of the rural population that had been making a modest living off the commons was forced to move to the cities and towns in search of whatever work was available to support themselves.
Summarize the points made in the lecture you just heard, explaining how they contradict points made in the reading.